Hello, hi, and welcome. If you're new here, my name is Sarah, and this is Wicked Reading. Today, I'm going to share with you guys the 12 books that I read in January. So, as always, I like to start my wrap-ups with my stats, which I just keep through Storygraph. So, as I said, in the month of January, I read 12 books, which equated to 4,038 pages. My top moods, I got a lot of very different colors than I'm used to because I did read a book, maybe two books that are in a genre that I don't typically read very much. But I got emotional, dark, tense, adventurous, inspiring, hopeful, mysterious, reflective, and informative. For my page count, majority of the books that I read at 50% were between 300 and 499 pages. And then 17% of the books that I read were 500 plus. I think that is just two books. And then 33%, so a third, which is 4 books, of the books that I read were under 300 pages. My top genres were horror, thriller, and fantasy, with a few of the books also including like romance elements, mystery elements, and so on and so forth. And then my format, I finally figured out how to like correctly pick the format that I was reading for these books. So this is actually slightly wrong because one of them I accidentally put as print, even though it was digital. I just have it print, so I like in my head because I was keeping up with it physically. It's still reading with my eyeballs, so I wasn't that concerned about it. Anyways, according to this graph, a third of the books that I read were physical reads with like the physical books, 25%, so a fourth of the books I read were digital, and then 42% were audio. So I still majority read more with my eyeballs than like my ears, and it equated to, technically this isn't like true really, but 2,890 pages being physical, and then 39.17 hours being audio. I did not actually listen for 39 hours because I speed up my audiobooks. Not like very much. My max tends to be like 1.75 times speed, and that's if the narrator is like particularly slow. Most of the time I just have it sped up to 1.5. But so the hours aren't like my true listening hours. And a couple of these books I did do audiobook and physical, but I counted it in the way that I did most of the book through. So anyways, I did rate all 12 books that I read in January, and my average rating was 3.38. So it was pretty low. Not gonna lie, January was a rough month. I was on a bad streak. This ended up being a quantity over quality type of month, and not like on purpose. Like I wasn't just reading books. Like I kind of was, but like I kept just like trying to get through books that I wasn't loving that much to just get to the next book, when I probably maybe should have DNF'd a few of these books. But so I wasn't like just trying to get my numbers up. I was just trying to find a book that I was really connecting to. So not a great month, but not a horrible month either. We do have a couple of 5 stars, and one of the books I just absolutely love. So I'm gonna go in order of how I read them, except the 2 books that are part of the same series I'm gonna talk about at the end, because they just like go together. So one of the first books that I finished in the month of January was Strega by Johanna Luque-Holm. This is a translated work from a, I believe, Slovenian author. I would classify this as like a literary book with some, I guess, mystery elements in it. I believe Storygraph does have it listed as a horror, but I don't know. So this book was just like not for me. Well, let me tell you what it's about. It's pretty much about this group of women that get sent to this hotel situation where they're going to like work for the summer, but seemingly nobody actually goes to this hotel for the most part, except like once in a while. But we're just essentially like following these women in the hotel. But this book is so confusing. I really did not vibe with the narrative style. This book is extremely stylistic, and I think that the author accomplished exactly what she wanted to accomplish with this. But for me, this book felt way too like artsy fartsy. The narrative style was just like, I hated it so much. Honestly, it's in first person. Like, we're in the head of the main character, but she has zero thoughts of her own and zero emotions and zero any internal conflicts or anything like that. The whole thing is just kind of like being seen through her eyes without knowing anything of her. And it's just about watching the other women, kind of. And then another thing with the writing style is there's a lot of repetitive sentences that were like purposely repetitive, but they were so annoying. I wish I had the physical book to read some lines to you guys, because like I don't really remember anymore. I'm trying to look at my notes. But it said like, I did this, I did this, I did this, we did this, we did this. Like there'd be 5 sentences in a row starting the exact same way. And it would just like really annoy me to listen to, because I did listen to this one on audiobook. Like I felt like it was attempting to be like hypnotizing, but it was just annoying to me personally. And then because we don't have any connection to our actual narrator, it felt like the story just felt super disconnected. It felt like I was watching a movie through a veil. Like the whole story was just super distant. And this is a pretty short book, but because of all of those issues I was having with like the writing specifically, this book felt like it dragged. It was such a slog. If I wasn't listening to the audiobook, I would have DNF'd it, but it was a short thing. So I was like, I'm gonna finish it. So it was just like not my style at all. But again, it's very unique. And I will say it was quite atmospheric if you were able to be drawn into the atmosphere, but that's pretty much it. Like it's strictly vibes. There's like, I guess a plot maybe, like there's stuff that happens, but it's very unclear what's happening also. So there's no conclusions really to be made with this book. And for me, I just didn't catch any themes. I really didn't know what this was. This is a very rare instance where I feel like a movie would have been much more effective, because it's felt like it was going for much more vibes and atmosphere. If it had like a movie score going on, it would have elicited more emotion. And this book was attempting to be very visual, but again, in a way that just like wasn't effective, because it wasn't like detailed visuals. It would literally be like a lamp, a bookshelf. Like this is literally how it was written. A lamp, a bookshelf, a picture on the wall. Just like not sentences strung together. So if that were like cinematic and it would flash those with like a musical score behind it, okay, now we're getting something. So I just felt like this book just like should not have been a book. It kind of gave like bell jar vibes, but in a very, very ineffective way. Like I really like bell jar, and it kind of gave those. I feel like maybe the author was inspired by bell jar, but it just like did not accomplish anything for me personally as a reader. And yeah, so that was Strega. And I gave it 2 stars because again, it is unique and I appreciate what it was doing. It definitely, I feel like, nailed what it was doing. It just was not at all for me. Then after that, I read Mosiac by Catherine McCarthy. I read this for Katrina Brown's book club, the Reaper book club, where she picks like all novellas. So this is a very short novella. I think it's like 150 pages, 154 pages. And the premise of the story is we follow this woman in the UK who gets hired to restore a stained glass window from this old church. And so she does that, and the church has like weird vibes pretty much. This book was a drag despite being a novella. I appreciated some of the atmosphere and the creepy stuff it was going for, but it just didn't really grab me. The main character was fine. I didn't love her. There's a lot of descriptive talk about her putting this like stained glass together, which is like the point of the story and like the title of the book. So like I get that, but it felt very unbalanced because there was a lot of that and then not as much other stuff going on. So I don't know. This one was like fine, but the writing just like wasn't my favorite. And by the end felt like the story was just getting started. So it just left me wanting more. It didn't feel really tied up. It wasn't like bad, but it's very forgettable for me personally. So I ended up giving it 2.5. I don't have like much more to say about it. But yeah. Then I read The Girl in 6E by A.R. Torrey. I'm not quite sure. This is I would say thriller about a cam girl who locked herself in this apartment, 6E, and will not let herself come out because she really wants to like kill people pretty much. Until like one day something happens where she decides to leave her apartment and pursue somebody. So this book was like okay. Again, I'm not a big thriller person for one. And because it's about a cam girl, there's a lot of like explicit sexual stuff talked about, which is like fine, but there was so much of that like in the first half. Like I wanted a little bit less of that and a little bit more of like the thriller second half of it, because it just got quite a bit repetitive. So I didn't like love that, and then I really didn't feel like the character was super genuine. I don't know what it is. Like whenever a character is trying to convince me that they're like a psychopath, like Mayfly, for example, it just like doesn't work. Don't just like tell me you're a psychopath. Like you're talking about a lot of stuff, but you're not like actually doing anything. They're just trying to convince me that they're crazy and like they're wild and they're unhinged and they're gonna do something. If they're not doing stuff to convince me and they're just telling me, I'm not gonna be convinced. So yeah, I just wanted a lot less from the first half of this book and a lot more from the last half of this book. And I don't know, just some of the stuff felt unnecessary. Definitely major trigger warning for kind of like sexual stuff in general, but then also there's stuff involving children in this book. So major trigger warning there. That is not something I love to read about by any means. And I didn't expect it to be in this book, to be honest. I thought it was just going to be like all consensual sexual stuff, and it's not all that. So trigger warning there. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like people really went wild for this book, and I was just like, it was whatever for me. Fast read, but yeah. Anyways, I gave it 3 stars. Then I listened to the audiobook for White Horse by Erica T. Worth. In this book, we follow our main character, Carrie, who is a Native American who is described as like a heavy metal listening, ripped jeans wearing, Stephen King reading woman. She is like 30 something in this book. And she ends up getting haunted by her mother after her cousin gives her a piece of her mother's jewelry, who obviously died when she was very young. So that's like the premise you go into this book with. But so this book was very family drama, and like it does have like the haunting stuff. It felt weird because it really felt like that wasn't necessarily the main focus of this book, or at least the main focus of the character, which really threw me off. If I'm being haunted by my mother, that is all I'm focused on. But she was like being haunted by her mother, but then also there'd be like family drama with her cousin and family drama with her like grandparents of her mother who she doesn't like talk to. And I don't know. So it was weird. The tone of this book was strange. I went into this with like an open mind because I had heard a lot of negative reviews about it beforehand, because it seemed like a lot of people were just like, well, it's just very character driven. So people don't like that, which I like a character-driven story, so I was like, okay, like, I might still like it because I like character-driven stories. I ended up not really liking this character, and it's not because she's, like, dislikable. She's just very inconsistent. So, again, she wasn't really, like, doing anything about the fact her mother was haunting her, which was pissing me off. And then some stuff happened where she would believe people that she virtually had never met. She would believe them over believing people who have been around her whole life, which pissed me off. I'm like, why are you blindly believing some people that you barely know, but then you're not believing other people? And then she was like totally ignoring so many red flags. And then there was like a moment where she goes to the Stanley Hotel, and I don't know. And she's supposed to like heavy metal, but the amount of times that Guns N' Roses was brought up, I'm like, that's rock. That's not heavy metal. But anyways, I don't know. The book just felt very jumbled. I don't even remember how this book ended now that I think about it. I just don't really understand what we were trying to accomplish with this one. I think that maybe, is this a debut? It feels like it might have been a debut novel where the author just had a lot of little things that they wanted to express, and then that's kind of what happened here. Is the messages and the main points got very lost and very jumbled, so it just felt weird. I don't know. I didn't really like it. I got really mad at this character at some points, and I was just like over it. But again, I don't know how to DNF an audiobook, so I didn't. But I gave it 2 stars. At this point in my January reading, I was like, what the hell? Is it me? Is it me, or is it the books that I'm picking up? I was really questioning what was going on because I was having such bad luck with books. But this was another 2-star. Bummer. And then this one is my most disappointing of the month because I was so hyped up about this book. I hyped myself up. I did it to myself. And I will say, I think as of right now, I am in the minority. But I haven't checked the reviews since this book technically came out. So I ended up reading This Wretched Valley by Jenny Kiefer. I actually read this as an e-arc on NetGalley, but it has since released. I think it came out the 16th of January, so you can buy this and get it at your library and all of that. So this book, I was so sad about because it sounded perfect. In this book, we follow this crew because they want to climb a mountain, hill, whatever, that's never been climbed before. And the whole point of this book is it was inspired by the Dyatlov Pass incident, which is a very notorious, very mysterious, strange situation that happened in real life from these real life hikers where they all ended up dying, and it was just very strange. And I've been very intrigued by that story because it's just so weird. So anyways, this book was inspired by that. So that really intrigued me. And I would classify this as like a supernatural horror. Oh my God, but this book I was getting so mad about. And again, I didn't DNF it because it was an arc, and I've only recently started reading arcs. So I just felt weird about DNFing it because of that. So I didn't, and I wish I did. Let me start off by saying what I did like, because this book wasn't total trash. This book is very gory, and I feel like the gore was done really well. I will say it kind of got a little bit repetitive, but the gore was done pretty well. And then there's a scene in this book that involved like flies and maggots that actually made my whole body tremble and like shiver. It was disgusting and super effective. And then there were some parts of this book that took on a like psychological aspect, and I felt like those moments were super effective, and that's what I wanted the book to lean into. But the book does go into a like supernatural type of situation, which I didn't love at all. I actually hated the approach completely. But anyways, I won't get into that because I don't want to like spoil anything. But what probably killed this book very early on for me was the characters are so one note. I have never read more one-dimensional, like the least complex, least dynamic characters I've ever read in my entire life are in this book. The one girl, she's a climber. That's it. That's all. That's it. Her boyfriend is her boyfriend, and he has a dog. That's it. The one guy, I forget his name, he researches topography type of stuff because he wants to find a new mountain that hasn't been climbed before. That's it. And then this other girl, she likes plants. And that's it. That's all we know about the characters. That's all they are, the whole fucking book. And for them to be so completely one note, for the exposition of this book to feel like 50% of the book, like nothing major really happens until so late into this book. For so much of it to be spent on these characters that don't feel like real people, that are making the dumbest mistakes. Like, these expert climbers aren't being experts at all. These characters were horrible. So bad. So it just like killed the book so early on for me, honestly. And then I just like didn't like the direction it went in. It was a super, super big letdown and a bummer. And yeah, 2 stars. After that whole stint of really underwhelming horror, I decided to shift gears into a lot more fantasy. And like other genres, I pretty much just decided no more horror for the most part for the rest of the month. So I ended up reading Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross after that. I do have this featured in a vlog where I decided to like just let my mood reading take over because of the luck, or rather bad luck, that I was having in January. So I ended up picking this one up, and I was very pleasantly surprised with this one. So in the story, if you haven't heard, it's a very popular book, but we follow our main character, Iris, who is a journalist at this place called the Gazette, and she is actually gunning for the same promotion against her like work enemy rival, Roman Kit. So they're gunning for the same job, and there's that. And then Iris' brother gets shipped off to war because a war has started between these two gods that kind of re-risen, and she wants to send him letters, but she doesn't really know where he went to because she hasn't heard from him at all. So she types him letters on her typewriter, but she doesn't know where to send them, so she like puts them under her closet and they just kind of like disappear. And then one day a letter is sent back, but all it says is, "This is not Forrest," and she ends up communicating with this mysterious person, which we know immediately who it is in the book, but she doesn't know. So she's communicating with this person, and then it turns into a situation where some of the characters actually become correspondents for the war. So they actually go to the war and they're journalists on the ground there and are corresponding for that. So there's kind of like 3 main things going on that encompass this whole book. It very much is like a romance, like historical romance. This is pitched as like fantasy romance, and the fantasy is very, very minimal in this book. I do think maybe the second one will lean into the fantasy a lot more, but the fantasy is very minimal. It's very much kind of about war and also this like relationship. So it's very like historical romance with war, I think. Now, I will say I really liked the romance in the beginning of the story with like the letters and everything. Once the romance and relationship was established, I didn't like it as much. I don't know. I'm a slow burn girly, so I like that stuff dragged out. I like the tension dragged out. So once the relationship was like established, I wasn't the biggest fan of the relationship. I don't think that that is the strong suit of this book, despite it being a lot of this book. What I really liked about this book was the war aspect and the fact that we are following these very normal journalists. They're not soldiers. They're being sent to war, and we see a very different side of war where we see that the city very close to the front lines is kind of taken over, where schools are turned into infirmaries, and there's still real people living very close to the war, and they have to, take cover when certain things appear to be coming near them. And there's just a very interesting aspect where the war isn't focused on soldiers and battles necessarily, but the kind of background effects and the side consequences that come from war and battles. So I really loved that aspect of this book. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I do think it was a very solid read, and it definitely kept my attention. It definitely was very kind of cozy in the beginning, which is what I really wanted, and the writing was very beautiful. I think that the writing is very well done in this book. The very first book that I did read this month was a 5-star, but it was part of the series, so I haven't talked about it yet. But this was like the first book in a while that actually like made me enjoy reading for the month. So I owe a lot to this book, despite it not being a perfect book, but it tore me a little bit out of a slump that I was nervous I was about to get into. So Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. Then I listened to the audiobook of Finding Me by Viola Davis. This was her memoir, and it has a lot to do with her upbringing and how she was raised. And then also it talks about how she really got into her career. She is an actress. So it talks about her going to Juilliard, which I did not realize she went there, and her theater acting and her living through that, and then eventually becoming like a really well-known actress. So this was a very, very well-written memoir, and I really enjoyed listening to Viola tell her story. Her upbringing was devastating, to say the least, but the way that she has like made amends with her upbringing, and the way that she is still so close with her family, and the way she talks about them was like super inspiring, and I really enjoyed listening to her story. And even just hearing how she became such a famous actress, I feel like she very much like de-romanticized the way celebrities and like actresses are seen, because we always hear the story like Chris Pine, I think, was just like randomly approached by somebody and asked for a headshot, and then he was all of a sudden in these shows and movies and all of that, and a big actor. And she really talks about how that's really not the case most of the time. That is like a 0.5% chance. She gave like the very realistic aspect to becoming like an actor or an actress. So I feel like I learned a lot through that. And yeah, her story is very inspiring, very sad at a lot of moments, but I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 5 stars. I highly recommend the audiobook since she reads it. Then I picked up Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. This is also in my vlog, so I'll keep this one brief. This is a magical realism fantasy type book, very kind of cozy, centered around death and grief, where we follow our main character. I don't remember his name. I feel like it was Wallace. Yeah, Wallace. We follow our main character, Wallace, who is a lawyer who's kind of just like a douchebag, not a very fun guy, does not care to make meaningful connections with people, doesn't have anybody close in his life, wants his employees to be scared of him, that kind of thing. And then he ends up dying, and then a reaper comes to collect him, to take him to the ferryman who is supposed to help him on his journey to like the next path. I appreciate this book and what it did, and like the themes it was grappling with. I feel like it did do a really good job of balancing the topic of death and the topic of grief, while also shining light on some very inspiring, I guess, and very positive aspects to it. It created a very nice atmosphere around death, I guess, and I did appreciate that. It does have a type of kind of like found family aspect to it, which I really liked. The thing is, I liked all of the characters except maybe Wallace, who was the main character. I just don't know how I feel about him still. But I really liked all the secondary characters. We do stay in one location the whole time, which got a little bit repetitive. And I don't know, for me, this isn't my typical type of story. So I just feel like it was a little bit long for me, because it's just like not my typical taste. So I just like wasn't fully connected to it, but I did really appreciate it. I thought it was very nice and sweet, and I thoroughly recommend this to people that think that it would be for them. I think it's a very applaudable and unique type of story that definitely belongs on a shelf. And yeah, but it just like also wasn't my cup of tea, pun intended. So I did give this 3 stars, but that's not to say it was bad at all. 3 stars still means I recommend it, still means it was good, just not obsessed with it. So there's that. Then I listened to the audiobook for How Can I Help You by Laura Sims. This is also in my vlog. For a synopsis, I'm going to keep it very brief because this is a pretty short book. We follow 2 women librarians and their paths cross. And one of the librarians has a very unhinged and disturbing obsession with kind of like old people and old people dying and like death. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. I ended up really enjoying this book. It was a very quick listen, and it is dual POV, which I really liked. I ended up really enjoying following both of the characters. Initially, I liked the main character a little bit more, but as the story goes, it gets kind of like wild. And I did really like the direction it went in. It is very unhinged. And it is very kind of like stream of consciousness. Our main character, Margot, we kind of just like follow her in her day-to-day and how she really kind of like consciously manipulates people around her, and how she's very much performing society and like performing conversations and connections to people. It's all very performative, and it's just really interesting to be in the mindset of somebody like that. I had a good time with it, and it's a very quick listen. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It's definitely like a higher 4 stars, like maybe even a 4.5. I did give it 4 stars, but like if we're comparing it to like Divine Rivals, I definitely probably liked How Can I Help You a little bit more, but there's that. Then I ended up listening to the audiobook for Bad Cree by Jessica Johns. In this book, we follow a Cree woman who has these nightmares, and the book opens up with her having a nightmare and then waking up with a severed crow's head in her hand. And she ends up kind of being haunted, I guess, by these dreams, and decides to make her way back home to the reservation that she hasn't been living on for a while, to reconnect with her family, to kind of figure out what these dreams mean. She's having dreams of her sister who died, so there's kind of like more going on with that story. So I did really enjoy this book. This is another one that centers a lot around death and grief and how we handle that. And this one also centers a lot around dreams, and I enjoyed that aspect to it quite a bit. I would say this is not super horror heavy, like upfront horror. It's very kind of character focused, and again, grief and death focused. For me, what I got most out of this book was family connection. In this book, we're following all these women in this family, the aunties and the moms and the cousins, and they're all women. And I just loved how connected they were and how supportive they were. And it just made me wish that I had like a very solid group of women around me. I just really loved that aspect to this book. That was like the shining aspect to this for me. I don't really know what else to say about this. This isn't like super plot heavy. I feel like it's very character focused and talking about family and connections and all of that, and kind of not rehashing, but reliving memories that you have with people after they leave this plane and all of that. So I really enjoyed it. I do feel like I didn't connect with the book the whole way through. I feel like it had very shining moments for me. So I am giving it 3.5. And then I read another e-arc, and that was for The Haunting of Velkwood by Gwendolyn Kist. If that's how you say her name, I'm not quite sure. I've heard it said a few different ways. So this book releases March 5th. Early March, this book comes out. I read Reluctant Immortals by Gwendolyn Kist, so I was really interested because I really did enjoy that one. That was like a 4-star for me. So I was really excited to see what The Haunting of Velkwood would do. So this is really difficult to explain what it's about. I read the synopsis and I was still confused. I've read the book and I'm still confused on how to like say what this book is about. We follow our main character, whose name is Talitha, and her 2 friends, her 2 girlfriends, when they were growing up, their like street that they grew up in, something happened, and now the street that they grew up in is kind of like, I visualized it as being like encapsulated in some mysterious, I don't know, veil, I guess, where people cannot go there other than our main characters, Talitha, Brett, and Grace, because they lived on that street, but they got away before this weird thing happened. So they are the only ones who are able to actually like go back into their neighborhood. So it's a very weird book. I would say it's like a weird ghost story, I guess. How do I feel about this book? It was interesting. I don't know that I fully know how I feel about this book. It was a very unique premise, and I liked some of the stuff, but I will say I got very annoyed with the main character, Talitha. We only really follow her, and some of it got quite a bit repetitive because she's kind of like going in and out of this like street neighborhood. And I feel like at the core of the story, it's kind of about confronting your past and confronting traumas and moving on from them. Maybe. I feel like maybe I'm grasping at straws, but I know that there's definitely some themes going on here, but I feel like not all of them are very clear, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But like, I don't know what else to say. It was interesting, but it just didn't capture me very much. I wasn't super connected. I wish we actually got more from Brett and Grace and like less from Talitha. Out of all those characters, like Talitha was not the most interesting. I feel like it was a decent book, but I definitely didn't like it as much as I enjoyed Reluctant Immortals by her. So I'm giving it 3 stars, but it's very unique. It's very weird. Like I've been probably making it clear, it's very hard to explain. So yeah, it was a decent read. Not my most favorite, but definitely a solid 3 stars. Okay, so the last 2 books I have to talk about, I'll talk about them together because they're both part of the same series. The books are Children of Fallen Gods and Mother of Death and Dawn by Carissa Broadbent. So this is the sequel and the 3rd sequel, so volume 2 and volume 3 from the War of Lost Hearts trilogy by Chris Broadbent. The first book is Daughters of No Worlds, and in the series we follow our main character Tisana, who is a slave in the first book, and very early on, we're talking like within the first like 20 pages probably, she ends up killing her master, who is a very well-known, very powerful man, and she is like fragmented and has some magical abilities. So after she kills him, she decides to run off and away to the Orders, which is a organization that trains people to wield their magic, and she ends up becoming an apprentice to a very reluctant mentor named Maxentarius, or just Max, and romance ensues from there. And then the rest of the series really has to do with Tisana wanting to free the rest of the slaves, and of course war happens and political stuff happens, you know, the whole fantasy drill. So that's where this series begins. The first book for me was pretty good. It was all right. I gave it 4 stars. I did enjoy it. I did not love the romance in the first book. Again, I'm a slow burn girly, so if we have a trilogy and the relationship is being defined in the first book, I'm kind of like, But let me tell you something. This book, this second book, the sequel, oh my God, it was so good. The sequel was so good. And it made me like, I'm just going to set this one down for now. This made me retrospectively like the first book more because I knew it was leading to this book. This book was fan-fucking-tastic. This is how you do a sequel. And I love the relationship now, let me tell you that, because there's a lot of moments where they get separated. So there's a lot of like longing and tension still. So I really love the relationship now, having it be like fully fleshed out. But the sequel was so good. We ended up getting an additional POV in this book, and this book just like, oh my God, there were so many like twists and turns in this book because we have no idea where that other POV is from. It's just like this other character that was introduced and we have like no idea. So we don't like figure out until the end of this book what the hell that POV is all about. But it was so good the way it all like connected. Ooh, I loved it so much. This book was so good. And then the way that this one ended, I was bawling my eyes out. There's this one page, I'm not going to read anything from it, but this single page has 4 separate tabs on it. Page 616. This page tore my heart out. Oh my God. And I was like, I was bawling my eyes out, but I loved it. I loved it so much. I ate this up. This book was fantastic. 5 stars. I actually finished this book and Strega on the same day, which was hilarious because this book was like so great and 5 stars and Strega was like 2 stars and not so great. But oh my God, like this was so good. This was so good. I love all the characters. Oh, it was so good. And then, of course, the 3rd book, this one was really good too, but this one had a lot more focus on war. Oh, I should say this one had a lot of like political drama too, which I loved. And then this one had a lot of war going on. And then we also end up focusing on an additional character in this book. This is another 3 POV one, where we just get a lot of introspective of that third character. And it was very interesting. So this one was really good too. I really enjoyed it. I loved how the series fully tied up in the end, like the last pages that we were left with. I loved it. I really enjoyed this story. The magic system in this world was something I kind of had, not like an issue with in the first book, but it felt a little clunky in the first book. The magic system, in particular with this one, gets so gory and grotesque. It's not like, I describe it in my vlog because I do mention this one. It's not like necromancy, but it's very similar. I feel like it's very adjacent to that. And it's very like rot heavy, necrosis heavy, very gross, but I loved it and I ate it up. So I really, really enjoyed this one too. I did give this one 4.5 just because like it didn't do the same thing that the sequel did, which it couldn't have. But yeah, these were so great. I'm so glad that I pushed through and finished this series. Not that I didn't like the first one. Again, it was still a 4-star, but it just like the way it ended, I was just like, oh, well, whatever. So I put these off for a while. And let me tell you, don't do that, because actually this one, it was really hard to get back into for a minute. It took me a while to remind myself and remember who all the characters were. Because the one thing I will say is these sequels don't do a great job at reminding you of what happened in the previous books, which is totally fine if you're binging these books. But if you take a hiatus like I did and don't read the sequel for months and months and months, almost a year, then yeah, you do tend to forget a little bit. So they don't do a great job at reminding you of everything that happened or like characters. So there's that warning. And I will say my biggest gripe with this series is that there's no map, which is kind of a bummer. So there's a lot of traveling in, well, actually in both of these, but particularly in the second one, I feel like we were introduced to a lot of new territories that we hadn't heard of. And I had like no idea of where these areas were in comparison to the other ones. So I will say I do wish that there was a map for these books, but I just loved these characters. I loved every single character in this series, good and bad. And I loved all the twists and turns. I loved the political stuff. I actually did enjoy the war. I usually don't like the sequels that focus on war, but this one was good. The character work is just so good in these books. And then the writing is very good. And I loved it. I loved it. So highly recommend that series in general, but specifically the sequel, perfect. So good. I wanted to save those for last because I knew that those were like pretty much the best books that I read this month and what I was like most hyped up to talk about. So I wanted to leave this on a good note because I know it started real rough. Trust me, I know it started real rough. So that is everything for today. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them. If you made it to this point in the video, leave me a ghost emoji down below so that I know. As always, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me while I sit down and talk about books. If you haven't yet, please give the video a like, subscribe for future content, turn on the bell notification, all the fun YouTube things that help you grow out, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye!